I'm Dr. Tom Rose. I volunteer for the Palm Harbor Museum, and I'm here interviewing John and Priscilla Chase. They have lived in this home since 1961, and they moved to Florida together in 1960. Their home is located on 6 acres in the middle of Highland Lakes in Palm Harbor, Florida. What I want to do to start this interview is ask John to talk about why his grandfather came to Florida in 1922, because that's really the reason they've lived here all these years, because of his grandfather deeded this property to John before he actually retired. So when Highland Lakes got built, their house was already here, long before Highland Lakes, almost a decade before Highland Lakes. It really didn't start till 71. So why'd your grandfather come to Florida, and what's his educational background?
Well, he came to Florida. These are family stories, because he had moved from New England to Virginia, and it was still too cold, and so he came to Florida. That's what he did. He was good for. He worked for Herbert Hoover on the Food Administration during World War I, and he had friends in the Department of Agriculture, and from time to time they would come to Florida to survey the citrus crop, and he came with them for a couple of trips, probably in 1921, 22, and he finally, on his second trip, or his final trip down here, he made a down payment on, I think, 40 acres of grove, which now is on Highway 19, in effect, and went back and told his wife they were moving to Florida. And he was middle-aged at the time. So he came to get away from, we're not real sure, but probably to, he didn't like the cold there.
And he'd also gone to Dartmouth College, finished Dartmouth College before he went to work for the Hoover administration.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, he was a class of 1896.
And he was born in Hanover.
Yeah, family, long time. The Chase family, long time in Hanover, New Hampshire. If you go into the old cemetery there, you'll see lots of stones.
From the 1820s.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. And then, so they moved here in 1922, and is that when they bought this grove? This was
he bought a piece of it in 22.
This grove was 95 acres, and it on the one side of it, it's directly on Big 19, mm-hmm. which is the term John uses for US 19, not alternate 19. And the main entrance to Highland Lakes is on this property that his grandfather originally owned.
Yes. Mm-hmm. This was the first piece of property that U.S. Home built on. Now, U.S. Home did not buy it from my grandfather. There was about a 7-year gap in between. He sold it after the freeze of December '62. The following summer, he sold it to some grove people who brought it back as grove. And then I think it was about 7 years later, they sold it to U.S. Home. So the people who made the big profit on the property was not my grandfather.
I knew that, and I'm sorry to hear that. But I guess it's a long gone decision, a long gone loss. So you came down here in the late 1940s and lived with your grandfather and went to school just after your grandmother had died. So
that's true.
You and your grandfather were bachelors together.
Yeah, and my father was here too. There was really the three of us. Yeah, I started halfway through the 7th grade at Dunedin Junior High, a structure that's still standing there on Beltrees.
And then where did you go to high school?
Clearwater. That was the only high school around. We had Largo, we had Tarpon Springs, and Clearwater, and that was it.
And then at that point, when you graduated from high school, you went directly to Rice University?
I did. Mm-hmm.
And why don't you, so you started at Rice, and how long were you there before you met Priscilla, who also was at Rice?
About 3 years, I think. 3 years, right? 52 to 55, yeah.
Yeah. I met him in October of '55.
And then after that, John was in the military for a few years.
I was in the Navy for 3 years, yes.
And when did you get out of the Navy?
In the spring of 60.
And you came straight down here.
I came back to visit, had no plans of staying here. But Pris and I, we had a little baby boy about a month old. And we were driving into Florida and we decided it looked pretty nice, maybe we should stay. And we did. Simple as that. That's the way these things happen.
And when you got here, you rented an apartment and you started.
We rented a little concrete block house in Seminole, Largo, in that area for about 1 year. About a year, yeah.
And when you were building this house, starting in 1960, how did you get from what was then a brand new road? Wasn't Big 19 built in the 50s?
This is a story of its own. It was a straight sand road, half-mile long from here to US 19. No shell, just sand. And we would, on certain occasions, we would get stuck, but not very much.
And what about the trucks filled with the construction materials?
I don't know how they did it. I wasn't here for most of it.
The well driller broke his truck. That's all I remember.
But that was their problem.
So what was it like around here in 1960? I mean, there was US 19, what you call Big 19, was that still a sand at that point?
Oh, no.
That was paved?
It was paved, and it had, I think it had 4 lanes. It was divided
With
through here.
Big, wide grass
Yeah.
median in between 2 lanes on one side and 2 lanes on the other.
But it's not like now with all these malls, all these strip malls.
Oh, no.
There
There
was
was-
nothing there, basically?
One Grove stand, Henderson's Grove fruit stand.
On the highway, which was half a mile away. Yeah, and nobody else. We had no neighbors. That was the closest.
Where did you go grocery shopping?
You went grocery shopping in Dunedin at the Publix, which was right in the same area as the Dunedin Library is now. Or you could go to Tarpon Springs, and there was a Publix there where Dan's pawn shop is, right in downtown Tarpon. 6 miles to Tarpon, 8 miles to Dunedin. And we always went to Dunedin because grandfather was there and John's father was there. So that's where we shopped.
And did they own a house in Dunedin or they rented?
They owned it. They owned
They
it.
owned a house.
Yeah.
And that was your grandfather had bought that in the 20s, or?
This is a story of its own. He bought 3 lots for back taxes in the late 30s, in the middle 30s, I guess. And he built this rather large house. It's still there.
What's the address?
1550 Santa Barbara. It's next door to Ben Skinner, just north of Ben Skinner's place. And Ben was not there then, but he built soon after I got here.
Dunedin Niles was established during the 20s, but it went bust, so to speak. And so there was nobody in Dunedin Niles very much when grandfather built.
No, there wasn't.
Was the road, when he built, was the road made out of bricks?
Yep, and it still is. When he came in 22, he rented someplace, and he built a house on Edgewater Drive. And after he'd had it about 3 years, he built another house on Edgewater Drive, and he sold the first house, and he held the mortgage on it, and he held the mortgage on the second house he built, and he wound up losing both houses in the Depression. And then he rented for a while, and in 38, 38, he built his house in Dunedin Niles on his 3 lots. And that was not mortgaged. He made very sure it wasn't.
That house cost him $12,000, and it's a large house. And he was really worried when we borrowed money to build this place because he had lost 2 houses, and the idea of going into debt did not appeal to him. He was worried about it. He said a little bit, not much, and we just went ahead and did it, and everything worked out.
So just for people today who are upset about the prices, what did it cost you to build this house, and what was your mortgage?
It was about 22,000, I think, wasn't it, honey?
Yeah, it was 22,000. That counted everything, like the well and stuff. And our mortgage, counting the escrow payment, was $185 a month. And the house was built in pieces. I mean, we built it so that we could finish parts of it later. And so we finished the downstairs later, we added the deck later, we added the laundry room later. So
It sort of grew like Topsy over 30, 40 years. Mm-hmm.
And were you always home with the kids, or were you working also, Priscilla?
no, I stayed home. And even after the kids all grew up, I did some sort of decorating, property managing work for friends, but not a great deal. And I mostly chauffeured for all the elderly Chase relatives that were here at that time.
So you had a lot of visitors.
My grandfather was sort of a patriarch of the family, and a lot of them followed him down here for wintertime things, not as permanent residents. Well, they did do that too, but yeah. So we had a lot of octogenarians when we were in our 30s, I guess.
Yeah, and all those octogenarians, practically to a man and woman, all lived to be in their 90s and their hundreds. So they were around for a long time.
And you cook for them also, I assume.
No,
Once or twice.
At Christmas and Thanksgiving, we would trade off. Well, they did it when we were young. When we had little bitty children, they were doing all the cooking. Grandfather and
Yeah, that's
the
true.
second wife, and then later on, when they all got very frail, we did it, and John's brother and his wife did it.
Yep. My grandmother died in 45, middle of 45. My grandfather was about 74, 71. He was 71 then. And 4 years later, he married a woman, another Helen, in 49 he did. So and I never met my grandmother. My grandmother, when I was 3, I think I met her. But we were not as mobile then. Nobody was, and especially during the war. And so nothing happened until she died in 45.
You mean nobody, because of gas rationing, people didn't drive to Florida?
Gas rationing and travel was just generally more expensive, and it wasn't as good,
And did you drive to work every day?
I did.
And tell us, where did you work?
Well, I was at the Honeywell plant on Highway 19, just south of Wilmington, 14.5 miles from here.
And when he
drove it.
started out, there were 3 stoplights. And when he got through, there were about 33 stoplights.
23, I think.
23. Oh,
Something like
okay.
that.
But there were only 3 at the beginning.
Yeah. Yep.
And did you had enough, because of your job, you had enough tickets to get enough gas?
Oh yeah. There's no rationing then. Is that?
During the war.
Well, no, this was in the 60s.
later.
This was in the
He didn't work.
60s.
Yeah.
He was in grade
Right.
school.
I got mixed up. I'm sorry.
Right.
Now I wanna. We can come back to where we are now, but I want to go backwards. The first time I met John was, I guess, a year or two ago. He was speaking at the Unitarian Church in Clearwater about his boat building days. So when he came to Florida, I guess he started building boats, and he built a lot of boats. And Terry Fortner has his talk on a DVD. I don't know what shape it's in, but that's a whole. If we're ever going to do that discussion again, we need all the pictures and everything, because the pictures really make it come alive. But just tell us a little bit about, you got this idea to build all these boats.
I think it must be genetic. I came here. I loved boats. Boats of almost any
came
kind.
Here, so we're back when you're about 12 or 13.
I was 13. I was almost 13, and within a year I'd built a little rowboat, A sailboat, actually. Very crude. Very crude.
And what? Oh, and you were at your grandfather's down in Dunedin.
Yeah, that's where I built it, as I recall. Must be. That was where I
You could
was.
sail it right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, his
Off
grandfather's
Dunedin Isles.
house was right on the water. It's the most southern house in Dunedin Isles.
That's the one that's at 1550 Santa Barbara. Yeah, I built that boat, and about a year later, I built a catamaran. It has the Dunedin Times that ran an article on it in the spring of '49. He was this little 15-year-old kid in a catamaran, and there were no catamarans then.
So that was the engineering in your blood.
Must have been.
Didn't you say there were some pictures or something in Popular Mechanics or talking about it?
I got the idea in the spring of, I can still remember, in the spring of '48 or the summer of '48, Popular Mechanics had an article about a guy in Hawaii who had made a catamaran. And I thought that really looked kind of neat because up till that point, all I had was this crummy little rowboat that I'd made. Actually, it was a sailboat, but it had a bamboo mast, no stays. It was crude, no dagger board, nothing like that. And in the summer, I made a balsa wood model of it, of a catamaran, little thing. And I noticed that it went pretty fast. And so I decided to make one for myself. And I made it was 16 feet. I started it in the winter of '48, '49, and I was sailing it in the spring of '49. And
then weren't there some other boats? Wasn't there did you build a miniature Greek fit?
Didn't build that. That came way later. That was in '55. The Christie brothers. These are Stephen and Richard Christie, the sons of William J. Christie, I think, who was the Dunedin postmaster for a number of years. Anyhow, they found this small Greek sponge boat in the mud on the bank of the Anclote River. This was the spring of '55, and they paid somebody $200 for it. And that summer we fixed it up, and it was the following summer then we took it on a trip hooking sponging. But in between that, then I had a double ender, a 22-foot double ender that I built in the spring of '50.
A sailboat.
A sailboat. Oh yeah, it was a sailboat. It was a good sailboat.
John still loves to sail. He still has a boat.
Mm-hmm. Still have it. It's out in the water, but I have a boat.
A Clarky Mills boat.
Yeah, it's a Clark Mills, the guy who designed the Optimist pram. I think everybody knows about that. Yeah, he designed some really good boats. It's the Suncat that he designed, and family boat, cat boat, big open thing, very safe to sail. And I still have it. I've had it. We've had it. We started in 70, 71? 70. And we finally put it, 40 years later, we pulled it out and fixed it up, and it's on a trailer about 100 yards over there now in the grass. Well preserved, though.
We got that boat. We had a friend that had a Suncat, and she saw an ad for a used one on Clearwater Beach, and she called us up and told us about it. And our friends, the Zeitlers, who lived on Indian Bluff Island, were pregnant with Libby, their last daughter, in 1970, and they decided that their sailboat, which they kept at their dock, was not a good boat for if you're going to have a baby in addition to their other girls. So they sold their sailboat, and when we found this one, the Suncat was available, we asked them if we could use their dock, and they said yes, and they were the greatest free marina for the next 40 years practically.
Until 2 years ago.
Yeah, and then they were no longer in their house, but they were renting it, and so we decided we shouldn't leave our boat there. It was not fair to the renters, so it's now on a trailer. But it was a great boat. Still is a great boat. Carries 12 people and a dog.
I mean, if we need a picture of that, we can get it sometime.
Oh,
and
yeah.
if somebody's looking at this 30 years from now, there's a film about Clark Mills that's been produced by Heritage Village, by the Anne Arundel County Historical Society. So that tells the story of Clark and the boats he built.
This is a very specific local design boat. It draws 9 inches with the boards up and 28 inches with the boards down, so you don't need to get stuck if you're sailing around here. You probably never see a boat like this up off New England.
You wouldn't want one there. You'd want one with a keel if you.
You need the weight up there.
You need a weight.
If it gets too windy here, you just put the boat away. Hi, we're gonna go backwards when we start to an earlier time. So one of the things that we have to understand about Palm Harbor is how poor it was. And also how much cheaper it was when people started buying lots along Lake Tarpon in the communities near just north of here and down on the Gulf by 19A. Things were half the price here than they were in Clearwater, and that's why their friends, the Zeitlers, moved to Indian Bluff Island rather than Clearwater, because I know how much they paid for that house, and it was much, much cheaper than Clearwater. Now, sometimes it meant maybe they went to the same schools, basically, so I don't really know if it made much difference. I mean, I don't know if the Dunedin school was any different than the Clearwater school. They were probably pretty similar.
I don't think it was.
Oh, the Dunedin, in the 60s when we had children in school, the Clearwater and Dunedin schools were probably on the par. I mean, they had San Jose Elementary and they had Curtis, which was originally Dunedin Elementary. But Palm Harbor had a very fluky school system. It was so small. They had Ozona School. It was
2-room school. Still standing.
Well, by the time we got to it, it had had wings added on the back. And so our first child...
Oh, Ozona Elementary School.
Ozona Elementary. And he went there the year after they had their very first kindergarten, and they did not have room for it at the school. It was in the Baptist church in their Sunday school rooms, and there was only one class. Our children went to kindergarten down in Dunedin at Good Shepherd Church because there were only 25 spots on the first class of kindergartners, and we could afford to send ours to private kindergarten, which was reasonably cheap. But there were a lot of Little Grove kids that couldn't, so we didn't for the first year. And then later on they had more kindergarten classes, and so my children could have probably gone because there were more classes, but they didn't want to. They wanted to go where their big brother went, so they did. And it was carpooling for us because we were so isolated. The carpool wouldn't come to me. I had to go to the furthest north house in the carpool every day and drop my kids off. And then one day a week I drove the whole thing. But it was worth it. I mean, it would have been 2 16-mile round trips otherwise.
And the school we're talking about is the Ozona Elementary School, which is still standing in 2013.
Except that what you're looking at for Ozona School is a brand new school that was built a number of years back. The original building is still there. It is now an area
administrative office.
Yeah, administrative office. And the front part of it is the original red brick school from about 1915. It's probably one of the five oldest schools in the county. I think the Anona School down in the Largo area is the oldest, and the school that's on South Fort Harrison was probably about 1911, and Ozona's about 1915.
Yeah. And Wall Springs is even earlier. The two-room school there that's still standing on alternate 19. That was built in about 1896.
And that did not last as long as Ozona and so forth.
It closed in 1947.
It had a very different life. It at one point was the Jersey Bar, and it's now
after 47.
Yeah, it became the Jersey Bar, and then it became Ye Olde Schoolhouse Restaurant. But
and now it's going to have another new name.
Oh,
New England Chowder House or something like that.
Okay, and but Palm Harbor and Ozona and Crystal Beach, none of them were really truly incorporated. They're just county, and you're taxed as county. And Dunedin was a city compared to Palm Harbor and Ozona. And most of the kids that went to Ozona School, by the time our children got there, were Grove workers' children, people that lived in Palm Harbor that had jobs like mailmen and standard jobs. But it was not a wealthy community, and the housing was much cheaper in Palm Harbor, but a lot of Grove children.
She's talking about people whose parents picked in the orange and grapefruit and lemon groves.
And worked worked
in the fishing industry, and the whole area was based on working in the groves and in the fishing industry. There were no other jobs.
And right in downtown Palm Harbor, there was a great big packing house, which is no longer there. In fact, I don't believe there are any packing houses at all in all of Pinellas County now. And so Ozona School, when my children went there, was K through 3. And then after 3rd grade, you went to Palm Harbor School. And that was 4th through 9. And then you went to Tarpon High, which was three years. And that I think we were the only 3-year high school even in the county. I know we were the only 4 through 9. It was sort of weird, but it was partly because we just didn't have the population of children to do it. The most they ever had when our kids were there were 3 first grades. That's as big as it got.
So we're talking about mid-60s.
That's our first child went in 1966, and then the next child went in 68, and the last child went in 1970.
But when you first came down, when you were in junior high school, there weren't. I don't know if you ever came up this way. I mean, I don't know if as a kid they ever drove your grandfather.
Not much. My grandfather, of course, he came up almost every day to get to his grove, and he had some grove equipment worked on in Palm Harbor. He was connected with the Palm Harbor the packing house in Palm Harbor, and with other growers in this area. But I didn't get in on that much.
But there were very few people living up this far in Palm Harbor, this far north.
Well, compared to now, yeah, very, very, very few.
I mean, they were in the hundreds along in here. I mean, none of these developments even started till the mid-50s.
That's right.
Here on Big 19.
And consider that our nearest neighbor was half a mile away. And in order to get, like city blocks where there are houses, you had to be in the old downtown Palm Harbor, Ozona. Yeah, there were houses there, but they were each one different from the other, or none of this tract houses that we have.
Subdivision didn't come till the mid-50s.
That's right. And they came slowly, even in the mid-50s. Yeah.
So there was a huge change between the mid-50s and the mid-60s.
And really, the push was 75 actually. The big push came after 75.
And
Disney World opened in 1970, and that's when all the tourists started coming down to see that. And once they saw Florida, they decided they wanted to live here. Of course, they weren't here in August and September, and there are a lot of people that bought houses here. And right here in Highland Lakes, they didn't happen to come except in the spring. That's when all the tourists would come. So they thought, what a great place. And then they buy a house, and we know several people on our block that moved after a couple of years because they couldn't take the summers. They just had no concept of it being as hot as it gets.
I just wanted to make a comment, sort of trying to put some of this together. When Priscilla's talking about the packing houses, they're on 19A, right in downtown Palm Harbor, right where the great big place that sells golf carts was a packing house.
No, actually, that was a lumber yard.
Oh, that was the lumber.
That is Yaco Lumber.
Okay.
And but the packing house where Pinellas Trail is, that was the railroad. And so the packing houses are always on the railroad because they ship the fruit north in rail cars. The packing house is right near where Galley Pizza is in downtown in Palm Harbor, isn't it?
That was the second. Their earlier packing house was across the street from the main drag, across the street from where Yaco Lumber was.
Oh, across from Yaco.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Yaco Lumber actually sawed their own lumber. It's not like today. There was basically a sawmill because the sawdust produced by the Yaco Lumber Company was used to build up roads and put on some very poor people's lots to get the house up higher.
Oh boy!
That wasn't a. I
Didn't know
don't think they
about
had
that.
an engineer involved.
Didn't know anything about
Don't know
that.
anything about it. Has anybody told you about if you go and stand at the corner where Scoggins Garage is and Yaco Lumber was, the opposite corners, if you turned and looked east up the hill, that back in the 50s, probably 40s, the 50s and 60s, that hill went up, and every year at Easter they did a sunrise service as the sun came up over the backside of the hill. And they don't do that anymore. But little bitty old Palm Harbor had this very nifty sunrise service that was on that street, because that was a hill. It still is sort of a hill.
And that hill was very important for the orange groves because they loaded the oranges onto originally big carts with 6 oxen pulling them, and later trucks, and they came down the hill to the packing plant because I think that they had too many oranges on to go uphill. They could come down.
This
So
is
that was-
this is not my
this is
experience.
before, but that hill was because there was a hill all the way along, so all these trucks and ox carts could come down the hill to the packing plant because they couldn't go up the hill. Anyway, let's. Partly, I wanted Priscilla to talk for a minute about where she went to school in Oklahoma because it's sort of contrasting it with here. I mean, so just talk a little bit about the schools you went to.
Well, if I'd gone to school in most of Oklahoma, I'd have been going to the little schools like this, and even Dunedin High, and I mean, didn't have a Dunedin High. You had to go to Clearwater. If I lived in where most people in Oklahoma lived when I was a kid, I would have had the same kind of schools. But there were 2 cities in Oklahoma. It's not like Florida with 5 or 6. There were 2 cities, and really, frankly, if you think about Oklahoma, you still hear about Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and that's what you heard when I was a little girl. And they had county school systems. And my high school that I went to had 3,000 students, 3,500 students. It was a 3-year high school. My graduating class had 863. it was a big school.
So let's contrast in how
175, Clearwater, 1952 graduating class.
it's almost 4 times as big.
And
Yeah.
Tulsa, when I lived there, had a population of 212,000. And that was a long time ago. But it's
Part of the reason was the oil money.
yeah.
That-
The biggest, the tallest building in Tulsa was the Skelly Building, Skelly Oil. The art museum was called Philbrook. It was the donated home to become an art museum from Phillips Petroleum. So that's where Tulsa and Oklahoma City made their money. And Oklahoma City was big and Tulsa was big, and the rest of it were teeny tiny towns that you never heard of, like Sapulpa and Okmulgee and Tahlequah, all little Indian towns. And Florida is an old state compared to Oklahoma. Oklahoma didn't become a state till 1907. And the Oklahoma runs for they opened up. Oklahoma was an Indian territory, and they opened it up to the general public in what they call the Run, and everybody lined up on the border in wagons and with horses, and took off at a gunshot to go and find land to homestead. And it was a late state, and Florida was here in the 1800s.
Yeah,
It was fighting in the Civil War. There, Oklahoma never did. But that's why, for one thing, that we wound up with 2 big cities, and the rest of it's very small. And the Depression didn't help anything. All the good farmland blew away.
See, Tarpon Springs didn't even become incorporated until 1888, and that's the year the railroad came. Same year.
Yeah.
So it was. You have to compare it with New Hampshire. New Hampshire's a really old state. Florida, Oklahoma are brand new states.
Yeah, they really are. Actually, Florida's the oldest settled place in the country, except when you get out in Arizona and New Mexico and California, because everybody thinks of New England and Virginia, and they were Johnny-come-latelys compared to all of the western, where all
So St. Augustine is the
St. Augustine.
1513.
Let's switch.
Yeah.
Let's just go to another.
We're
thing
jumping
we
around.
wanna talk
We're
about.
getting off your stuff.
So how'd you get around, John?
How'd they get around?
In high school, I mean, you
Bicycle.
walked
Bicycle, and there was a school bus that picked up the Dunedin kids and took them to Clearwater High School. Yes, yeah, I can still remember where it used to stop right where the Chamber of Commerce is at the main intersection there in Dunedin. And I'd ride the bus about half the time and take a bicycle about half the time.
And what did kids do for fun when you were in junior high and senior high?
Fun?
Yeah, what did they do when they were out of school?
We can't talk about that.
Well, how about let's talk about something we can talk about. We'll come back to fun.
No. It was the usual. It was sports. A lot of after school things. There was some drama stuff. There was sports, of course. And
if kids had
clubs.
access to boats, they would. The big thing was to sail over to the islands, and the kids that were able to sail on a parent's boat or build a boat like John did, they got to sail. And
I can't speak for Clearwater. Can only speak for the Dunedin kids.
yeah.
So you sailed over to Honeymoon Island.
We did, well, a little bit, but mainly it was Caladesi. Of course, Caladesi wasn't attached. It wasn't a park then. It was just an island called Hog Island. Yeah.
It didn't have a causeway.
It didn't have a causeway. It hadn't been connected. The erosion and whatnot had not connected it to Clearwater yet. No, we did a lot of that. Mainly boys, junior high school, a little bit of high school, but the Clearwater kids were more
stricter with girls in those days.
It's hard to. I can't really say that. I don't know.
It
wasn't a matter of being strict even with boys.
There wasn't much to do.
It was a very safe place. Really was. It was a very safe place to go and sail. I mean, nowadays they talk about people thinking about sailing on a sailboat by yourself in the Caribbean because people have been raided and people.
It's not so simple.
You mean-
It's
Not so
Seemed to-
safe as it used to be. And now, when our kids, we'd let our kids, we had sailboats for our kids, and we'd let them go out and spend the night on those spoil bank islands out in the Sound.
It was different. It's hard to say what caused it, but yeah, things were safer then. I used to hitchhike a lot, not in Clearwater so much, but long distance hitchhiking. And the common wisdom is that it's more dangerous now, and probably slightly more, but not much. I think a lot of the stories get built up, they grow out of proportion because of the media. But I sat down once and I've hitchhiked 15,000 miles total.
Wow.
I did. Most of it by myself.
And one thing
I bet. Did you hitchhike, Priscilla?
No.
That was not done. But the one thing about it is the population was so much less, and so there's always a certain element that would keep hitchhiking not being safe, but there were fewer of them.
But you also knew all your neighbors. Both of you.
Yeah. Hitchhiking in town would be easy. Well, I just didn't do it because I had a bicycle.
And I want to ask about one other thing that we've completely missed. Was your grandfather a member of a church down here?
No.
When you came down?
No.
No.
He grew up
was.
in the Methodist Church before it was the United Methodist Church. The Methodist Church had a reputation for very strict. This is in New England. And I think he decided fairly early on that he wasn't going to go anymore, and he went to weddings and funerals, and that was about it.
But John's grandmother.
My grandmother, his wife, she was a little different. She was very active in the Episcopal Church in Dunedin.
Oh, the one that's still there.
Yeah,
Right on
same
19A.
one.
Yeah, that's a beautiful church.
Well, it is. She was, and she
And
did
what,
that.
And what about the two of you? When you got married and you got down here, did you join a church?
We did.
After a few years.
Well, pretty much
After
by the
about
time
2
David
years.
was 2.
Okay, 2 years, right.
I was raised an Episcopalian, and when we first came down, we heard that there was a plan to put in a mission in between Dunedin and Tarpon Springs. And so I signed up to go to the Tarpon Church because it was closer. And I started going there when our oldest child was about 2, and that's where we met the Zeitlers. Their second daughter was in the same Sunday school class of 2-year-olds. And after about a year or 2, they decided that they had enough people living around to start the mission. And so they sent out notices to people in the 2 churches, Good Shepherd and All Saints in Tarpon, and people volunteered, and we held a meeting at the home of Bob and Peggy Holloman down in Dunedin, and we signed up 25 people, and that became the beginning of St. Alfred's Church, which is on Curlew Road, just east of County Road 1. And that's where we went to church until probably mid-'80s. And John is very affiliated now with the Unitarian Church down in Clearwater. But the church that we went to was served by Bob Breester. He was the rector, and his wife Betsy. His daughter was our babysitter. We had a hard time getting a babysitter out here in the Grove, because for one thing, none of the little girls generally that knew how to drive that were babysitters were scared to death of our road. And I had one of them that came one time, and then she would babysit if her mother would come with her. But our first babysitter was the daughter of R.U. Boyd, who was the depot agent in Dunedin for years and years and years. And the Boyds lived across the tracks from the depot, and they had 8 children, and the 4th child was
Something like
John's best friend in high school, one of his best friends. And Mrs. Boyd was like my children's grandmother, because she had grandchildren, and my mother had grandchildren, and they were both frustrated because they couldn't get at their grandchildren. Mrs. Boyd never saw hers because they were way far away, and my mother never saw mine except once a year because they were way far away. And I mean, we were from her. She was still living in Oklahoma. And Mrs. Boyd was just like a grandmother to my children. And their daughter Ann was our first babysitter. And then when she left home and got married, the Reister's daughter was old enough, and she became our second babysitter. And they were hard to come by for us. They really were. And we had Palm Harbor was so small in population, and the fact that our family was still lots of them in Dunedin, our ties went towards the Dunedin area more than Tarpon. Changed totally in some ways when our kids went off to Tarpon High, because that's where they went to high school. But
I just wanted to say one more thing, and we're going to end this, is that the last interview I did was with Amy Kelly. And Kelly's parents on Indian Bluff Island were very close friends with your friends, the Zeitlers.
2 doors down.
Right, 2 doors down. And the Zeitlers were like you in doing innovative things and not doing things the way everyone else did them, because when they came to Indian Bluff Island, they told the developers they wanted a 2-story house. And they said, we don't have 2-story houses here, we only have 1-story house. But the Zeitlers built a 2-story house, and it was the first one. And just, Dr. Zeitler was a psychiatrist, and he worked at, what's it called, Anclote
Manor.
Anclote Manor, which
It
was a
was
psychiatric hospital.
in Tarpon Springs, and it's no longer there. It started in a great big old house, and then it got added on to, and it became a psychiatric hospital. And a lot of people that lived on Indian Bluff Island had bigger houses, fancier houses than anything that was in that was in Palm Harbor. And when they built Indian Bluff Island in the 60s, pumped it all up, there were a lot of doctors that lived there, and there were a lot of professors from University of South Florida. There was an obstetrician, Dr. Hudgens. He had a practice in Dunedin. Chris and Margaret Kiefer. Chris was Shakespeare professor at University of South Florida, and Margaret taught at Palm Harbor Middle School. And so that was the first area that you would say in Palm Harbor that really had bigger houses and people with a little more money. The rest of it was people. I mean, Palm Harbor didn't have a lot of industry or anything much for jobs. That's one reason why it didn't have a big economic base.
Most people who lived in Palm Harbor in those days who came here with some education worked in Tampa. That was.
And
I'm talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s.
Here's an indication of the ties were more to Tampa for work and stuff like that than to St. Petersburg, because the St. Petersburg Times was a long-time paper. But if you lived in Dunedin in the 1960s and 50s, you took the Tampa Tribune. It's just what was done. The tie was with 580 and Tampa. And that road that is 580, when we moved here, it had been built in the 40s, and it was a big deal. And it was a 3-lane road, and it was concrete sections. Most everything around here was brick, and then it got to be asphalt. But that thing was built, and you would drive to Tampa on 580, and there were these big concrete sections with tar and so you'd go ka-wump, 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 all the way to Tampa. But that's where you went. And if you had to go to the department store, there was Moss Brothers in downtown St. Petersburg, and it was a 2-floor building. Or you could drive to Tampa, and it was right downtown. It was a big 7-floor
When I was in junior high school, they were still referring to 580 as the Tampa shortcut. Because until then, to get to Tampa from Dunedin, you had to go way north around Tampa Bay, around the up northern edge of Tampa Bay, and then south. It was a big deal.
And they didn't have the Howard Franklin Causeway. They had the Courtney Campbell, and they had the Gandy. And
well, those came afterward. The Tampa, no, I beg your pardon. Gandy came first, didn't it?
Gandy came first, and then the Courtney Campbell. It was originally called the Davis Causeway, and all the old timers called it Davis Causeway. It was built by the guy that built Davis Islands, and he built it with mules. I mean, that's what they used to haul all that stuff. And then they named it for some fancy pants highway commissioner named Courtney Campbell.
Well, I want to thank Priscilla and John for sitting here with me today. I think it's been extraordinary and interesting, and you can imagine somebody watching this in 30 or 40 years. You're not going to be around for them to check with them.
No, they won't.
So they're just going to have to believe what they heard.
We already have that problem with our elders. They're gone.
And I can't tell anybody too much to think about anything you might want to ask them, because boy, after they're gone, you really find all the stuff you wished you'd asked.
Yeah, I wish you guys who are doing the filming here would talk to your history teachers about this, because it's I mean, you asked a great question about what was the socioeconomic situation. This was a very rural, very, very poor area.
It really
was. Till after the war.
And the citrus made more money for people during the war. That's what really helped, because Florida was so poor and so dependent on real estate. The real estate bust preceded the Great Depression here. It was in the 20s. 26. Mm-hmm. John's grandfather went into the Depression. He sent a train car, a boxcar of fruit to New York City, and it didn't sell, and he lost all that money. And so the real estate bust came here before 29.
We're winding down.
Yeah.
That's okay. Let's just follow up on that, though. That when he sent, how was he able to send? Were those his own oranges, your grandfather? That was his own growth.
His own fruit.
Yeah. Yes, he contracted to a guy to pick it and ship it north to New York City, in fact. And that was in 32. And it shipped it there, and it didn't sell. And it was $60,000 worth of fruit, which was a lot of money then.
60 was huge.
Like $1 million.
That is what led to him losing his 2 houses, his original house and his second house, because he had balloon payment mortgages, and he went bust.
Here, okay.
Okay, thank you very much.